Chapter 1. The day they decided I was expendable. At the weakest moment of my life, my family asked me to sign everything away. I was grieving my father, barely able to stand, and they called it a reasonable solution. They erased my name, rewrote the truth, and expected me to disappear quietly. They thought my silence meant weakness. What they never realized was that I was listening, watching, and letting them believe they had already won. This is a true revenge story, told by MC. I was 42 years old when the people who should have protected me decided I was no longer necessary. That decision was not made in anger or panic. It was made quietly, carefully, while I was still weak enough that they believed I would not fight back. Less than 3 weeks earlier, I had buried my father. A week before that, I had walked out of a hospital with my body stitched back together and my strength not fully returned. I was not visibly broken. I could stand, I could drive, I could hold a conversation. But everything inside me felt delayed, as if my mind and body were no longer moving at the same speed as the world around me. Grief did not arrive all at once. It came in waves that caught me off guard. Fatigue did the same. Some mornings I woke up convinced I was fine, only to find my hands shaking when I tried to pour coffee, or my legs aching after standing for a few minutes too long. I learned quickly how to hide it. People are more comfortable when your weakness stays invisible. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning. It was short, polite, and signed with the familiar letterhead of my father's law firm. It asked me to attend a family meeting to review final arrangements. Nothing in the wording suggested conflict. I assumed it was paperwork, formalities, the final administrative steps that follow a death. My father, Richard Cole, had built Cole Infrastructure LLC from nothing in central Iowa. He started with one aging truck and municipal repair contracts that paid just enough to keep the lights on. Over 3 decades, he turned it into a regional construction and utilities firm with steady public work and loyal employees. I grew up watching him leave before sunrise and come home exhausted, but proud. When my mother died, the house became quieter, and when he remarried years later, I was already grown. His second wife, Elaine Cole, never treated me poorly. She treated me carefully. There is a difference. She spoke kindly, kept her distance, and never crossed a line that could be clearly defined. Her son, Mark Reynolds, was harder to ignore. He had a way of filling rooms with confidence, even when it was not earned. My father wanted peace more than confrontation, and Mark learned early how to use that. The morning of the meeting, my body reminded me that recovery is not a straight line. My hands trembled slightly as I buttoned my coat. Standing too long made my head feel light, so I moved slowly, deliberately. I chose flat shoes and loose clothing, anything that would not draw attention. I told myself to breathe. I told myself this was routine. Driving into downtown Des Moines, my grip tightened on the steering wheel every time traffic slowed. I felt disconnected from my surroundings, as if I were watching myself from a distance. By the time I parked, my shoulders ached with tension. The law office looked exactly as it always had: neutral artwork, soft lighting, the kind of space designed to calm people who were already overwhelmed. I checked in at the front desk and waited. When the conference room door opened, Mark was already seated at the table. Elaine sat beside him, hands folded neatly in front of her. No one stood when I entered. Mark did not ask how I was feeling. He did not mention my father. He slid a thick stack of papers across the table as soon as I sat down. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed. He said this was the most practical solution. He said the company needed stability and clear leadership. He said I had been through enough and deserved peace, not responsibility. According to him, signing the documents would give me a clean break and a modest settlement, enough to start over somewhere else. He spoke as if he were offering relief. I glanced down at the papers without touching them. The legal language blurred together. My mind felt slow, like it needed extra time to process every sentence. Mark kept talking, explaining how my father would have wanted the business protected from emotional decisions. He mentioned my health more than once, not with concern, but as justification. Elaine nodded occasionally. When she spoke, her tone was soft and reasonable. She said she only wanted what was best for everyone. She reminded me how fragile things could become during transitions like this. Her eyes stayed on the table, never fully meeting mine. Something inside me began to withdraw. Not fear, not anger. It was a familiar response, one I learned years ago when speaking up only made things worse. I listened. I noticed how Mark avoided specifics and how Elaine framed every statement as care. When I finally said no, my voice was quieter than I expected. I told them I was not ready to sign anything. I said I needed time to think. Mark leaned back in his chair, and whatever patience he had been pretending to have disappeared. He said the house was no longer mine to occupy. He said arrangements had already been made. If I chose not to cooperate, I would need to leave within 72 hours. He listed dates and timelines with the ease of someone who had rehearsed this outcome. He made it clear this was not a threat. It was already decided. The room felt colder. My chest tightened, and I became acutely aware of how tired I was, how little strength I had left to spare. That house was the only place that still felt connected to my father. I looked at Elaine then, searching for something human. For just a moment, her expression shifted. Not regret, not sympathy, relief. I stood slowly, steadying myself against the edge of the table. I said I needed to leave. Mark did not stop me. He watched me with a look that told me he was certain I would return, certain that exhaustion and grief would do the work for me. Outside, the afternoon light felt harsh. I sat in my car longer than necessary, my hands resting uselessly in my lap. My phone buzzed with a follow-up email outlining next steps and deadlines. Everything had already been set in motion. As I drove away, the truth settled in with painful clarity. This was never about efficiency or protection. It was about timing. They had waited until my father was gone, and my body was still healing. They had chosen the moment when resistance would cost me the most. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I felt something solid form beneath the shock, a stillness that surprised me with its weight. They had mistaken my silence for surrender, and that was the moment they made their first real mistake.
Chapter 2. When I stopped defending myself. By the time the sun rose the next morning, I understood something I had not allowed myself to see before. The story about me was already being told without my input, and it was moving faster than I could keep up with. Once I accepted that, the need to defend myself faded. Silence was no longer a reaction, it became a position. The days that followed were quiet in a way that felt intentional. No raised voices, no dramatic confrontations. Just a steady flow of instructions and reminders delivered with polite distance. Emails arrived with subject lines that sounded reasonable and neutral. Transition timeline, property access, final coordination. Each message assumed compliance. I walked through the house slowly, noticing how different it felt when you knew you were temporary. The rooms looked staged, like a model home waiting for new occupants. My father's chair still faced the window. His coat still hung by the back door. I touched nothing. I was careful not to disturb the illusion that I had already been removed. My body had not caught up with any of it. Standing too long made my legs tremble. Some afternoons I had to sit on the floor and wait for the dizziness to pass. I moved deliberately, conserving energy, measuring each task. Recovery teaches you how to be invisible without trying. The final notice came 3 days later, a short message confirming that movers would arrive in the morning. No apology, no explanation, just logistics. I read it once and closed my laptop. I did not respond. The movers arrived just after 8. 2 men in matching shirts, polite and efficient. One of them asked where to start. His tone was casual, practiced. I pointed toward the living room. He nodded and said it would not take long. He did not ask why the house felt occupied but unlived. I stood in the hallway as boxes were filled and furniture was wrapped. The men worked quietly, calling out measurements to each other. At one point, one of them glanced at a framed photo of my father and me on the mantel and said softly that it looked like a nice place. I nodded and said nothing. The comment lingered long after he moved on. Outside, neighbors passed with brief acknowledgments. One woman paused and asked if everything was all right. Her eyes lingered a moment too long, waiting for a version of the story she could recognize. I told her I was moving. She nodded, satisfied. Simplicity is comforting. By noon, most of my belongings were gone. What remained fit into the back of my car. I left the keys on the counter and closed the door without looking back. There was no dramatic exit, just the quiet finality of something decided elsewhere. The isolation followed me. At the company, it was immediate. I had not been there regularly in years, but I still knew the people. I reached out to a former colleague about a personal item I had left in my office. The reply came hours later, short and formal. He said he would check. He never did. Another person sent a message advising me to let things settle. He said it would be easier for everyone. The language felt familiar. Stability, transition, best interests. Words I had heard before, now echoed back to me by people who had not been in the room. I did not correct them. I did not explain. I began writing things down instead. Who responded quickly? Who delayed? Who used the same phrasing Mark had used? At one point, an email was forwarded to me by mistake, addressed to a group I was no longer part of. The tone was reassuring. The plan was already in motion. Reading it felt like confirmation rather than discovery. Evenings were the hardest. Without the pressure to perform or respond, my thoughts sharpened. Exhaustion settled deep in my bones, but clarity came with it. I slept in short stretches, awaking alert and unsettled. Patterns began to form. It was during this time that Margaret Liu called. She had been a close friend of my father's, a retired forensic accountant who had helped him through audits and contract reviews over the years. Her voice was steady, familiar. She said she had heard things were complicated. She asked how I was holding up. We met at a small cafe on the east side of Madison. Margaret arrived early, already seated, a notebook open in front of her. She did not offer condolences. She slid a cup of coffee toward me and asked practical questions. When had I last seen my father review financial statements? Who had access to the accounts when his health declined? Whether I had copies of any correspondence from his final year? I answered slowly, searching my memory. Margaret listened without interrupting. At one point, she leaned back and said that serious family conflicts rarely begin with cruelty. They begin with convenience. When removing someone is easier than negotiating with them, the choice feels justified. She asked if my father had mentioned anything unusual before he died. I told her about his frustration, the way he had dismissed small discrepancies as nothing worth worrying about. Margaret nodded. She asked if I could access the last full set of reports he had reviewed. I told her I would try. That night, I went through old files, digital folders, printed statements, emails saved without intention. I worked in short intervals, stopping when my body demanded it. I saved copies. I wrote dates in a notebook. I was not looking for proof. I was learning the landscape. A few days later, Margaret called again. She said something did not align. The differences were small, minor enough to escape casual notice, but they were consistent. She said consistency was rarely accidental. I felt something shift. Not relief, not triumph. Focus. I stopped thinking about how I appeared to others. I stopped worrying about being misunderstood. Silence created space, and in that space, people revealed more than they intended. At the end of the week, I sat alone in a borrowed apartment, boxes stacked against the wall, my notebook open on the table. I was still tired, still healing, but my attention had sharpened. I was no longer trying to prove anything. I was watching with intent.
Chapter 3. What he never expected me to find. I began to understand that what had been taken from me was not just property or position, but information. The people closest to my father had decided which truths I was allowed to see, and which ones were easier to keep buried. Once that realization settled in, everything I had witnessed in the past months took on a different shape. Margaret and I met again 2 days later at her apartment in Madison. It was a modest place, quiet, lined with shelves of old binders and handwritten notes. The dining table was already covered with folders when I arrived. She moved with the calm precision of someone who trusted process more than instinct. She looked at me and said, "Let's separate what you know from what you've been told." I told her everything I could remember from my father's final year. The phone calls he took in the evenings, the emails he reread but never forwarded, the way he had paused mid-sentence more than once, as if something did not sit right, then dismissed it with a tired smile. Margaret listened, writing dates along the margins, occasionally circling a note without comment. "This rarely starts with theft," she said quietly. "It starts with access and silence." We worked side by side for hours. There was no dramatic discovery, no sudden revelation, just long stretches of reading, comparing, and setting documents next to each other. Margaret's eyes moved quickly, trained to notice what mine skimmed past. Every so often, she would stop and tap a page. By late afternoon, my concentration began to slip. My head felt heavy, and my hands trembled slightly when I reached for a glass of water. I had to sit back and close my eyes for a moment, grounding myself in the chair. Margaret noticed but said nothing, giving me the space to recover. When we resumed, she opened a thinner folder and placed it in front of me. I recognized the first page immediately. It was my father's estate paperwork, the same version Mark had presented with such certainty. Margaret placed another document beside it, less polished, clearly older. "Your father amended this in late 2022, she said quietly. "He did it properly, quietly." My fingers tightened against the table edge. I had to pause, drawing a slow breath, my chest feeling suddenly tight. "That's not what they showed me," I said. "I know," Margaret replied. "What you were shown was incomplete." She walked me through the amendment slowly. It did not remove anyone outright, but it imposed limits. It named an independent trustee. It set conditions for control. It made it impossible for one person to act unchecked. The document was notarized, filed, and legally binding. My father had been careful. As the implications became clear, my hands began to shake. I rested them flat on the table, waiting for the sensation to pass. The room felt very still. "They knew about this," I said. "At least one of them did," Margaret answered. Then she turned to another set of pages, pension fund statements, small withdrawals spread across months, each amount insignificant on its own, together unmistakable. "This is not a clerical error," she said. "It's a pattern. Someone assumed no one would ever look closely." I wanted to argue. I wanted to believe there was another explanation, something accidental or benign. But the numbers did not bend to comfort. They simply repeated themselves. Driving home that evening, everything replayed in my mind. Mark's confidence, Elaine's calm detachment, the way they had spoken as if the outcome were already sealed. I understood then why Mark had not hesitated. He had counted on my exhaustion, my grief, my silence. The days that followed were measured and methodical. I requested archived emails under the guise of personal record-keeping. I cross-referenced dates. I compared financial reports with correspondence. I worked in short intervals, stopping when my body demanded it. Each confirmation added weight, not relief. At night, doubt crept in. I wondered if continuing would only confirm the story they were already telling about me. A woman driven by money. A woman unable to let go. The thought made my stomach twist. One evening, I called Margaret. My voice sounded smaller than I wanted. "What if I stop?" I asked. "What if I walk away now?" She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "You would survive, but you would always know exactly when you chose not to see." A few days later, she arranged a meeting with Daniel Brooks, an estate and corporate attorney she trusted. His office was unremarkable, practical rather than impressive. He listened carefully as Margaret laid out what we had found. He did not interrupt or offer reassurance. When she finished, he turned to me. "I won't promise you a win," he said, "and I won't promise you speed." I asked him what would happen if I moved forward. "People who believe they are secure will react," he said. "You will be questioned. Your motives will be questioned. Relationships will fracture." "And if I don't," I asked, "then nothing changes, except your understanding of it." I left his office feeling afraid in a way that was oddly steady, not panic, not despair, just awareness. That night, alone in my apartment, I spread the documents across the table. I thought about the care my father had taken to protect what he built. I thought about how confidently Mark had told me everything was already decided. By morning, my choice was clear. I would not reveal what I knew. Not yet. I would not correct their assumptions or challenge their version of events. I would let them believe they had won. Silence was once mistaken for weakness. Now it had purpose. It was no longer absence.
Chapter 4. I let him think he had won. I walked into that meeting knowing something Mark did not. The balance had already shifted. He just could not see it yet. I reached out to him a few days earlier, carefully choosing every word. I told him I was tired, not angry, not demanding, just worn down. I said I wanted to settle things quietly and move on with my life. I did not ask for fairness. I asked for an ending. He replied quickly. His message was warm, almost relieved. He said he was glad I had come to my senses. He said he had always hoped we could resolve this like adults. He suggested one final meeting to put everything behind us. I agreed without hesitation. The location was a small conference room near the outskirts of town, a place the company sometimes used for low-level negotiations. No windows facing the street, no reason for anyone to pass by. Neutral, controlled, forgettable. Exactly the kind of setting Mark liked when he believed he held all the cards. I arrived early and sat alone, letting the room settle around me. I made sure I looked the way he expected, slightly withdrawn, shoulders tense, hands folded together as if I were holding myself upright through effort alone. I did not rehearse lines. I did not need to lie. I just needed to let him assume. Mark entered first, smiling easily. Elaine followed him moments later, composed and elegant, carrying herself like someone accustomed to being respected. "I'm glad you came," Mark said as he took his seat. "I know this hasn't been easy for you." I nodded, keeping my eyes down. Elaine placed her purse neatly on the table and leaned forward. Her voice was gentle, almost maternal. "We only want to protect the family," she said, "and the company. None of this needs to turn into something public." Public, the word was, deliberate. Mark slid a slim folder across the table toward me. It was thinner than the one he had brought weeks earlier. "This is revised," he said, "more generous, a clean break." I did not touch it. "I don't have the energy to fight anymore," I said quietly. "I just want it to be over." Something shifted in him then.
The tension he had carried dissolved. He leaned back, folding his arms behind his head, his confidence settling in fully. "I knew you'd get there," he said. "You're smart. You know when it's time to stop pushing." Elaine smiled approvingly. "Your father believed in peace. He wouldn't want this kind of conflict hanging over us." Mark began to talk more freely after that. He spoke about the company as if it were already settled inheritance, about contracts that were nearly finalized, about decisions made during my father's illness, moments when things had to move fast. "We couldn't wait," he said casually. "Someone had to step in." Elaine laughed softly, and everything turned out fine. I listened without interruption. At one point, Mark chuckled and looked directly at me. "You didn't really think you could stop this, did you?" I did not answer. For a brief moment, doubt flickered across his face. He studied me more closely, his smile tightening. "You're quieter than before. It's almost unsettling." My heart thudded once, hard. I kept my breathing slow. "I'm just done, that's all." The moment stretched. Elaine shifted in her chair, then waved it off. "She's exhausted. Of course she seems different." Mark relaxed again. "Good," he said. "Then let's finish this." He continued talking, filling the silence with explanations and justifications. He mentioned moving funds to keep things running smoothly. He described temporary reallocations, short-term decisions. Each sentence added another thread. Elaine interrupted him once, gently. "Careful," she said, then laughed. "No one's recording us." I lowered my gaze and said nothing. Eventually, Mark pushed the folder toward me again. "Sign this, and we can all walk away." I rested my hands on the table. "I just need a moment," I said. He nodded indulgent, as if granting a child extra time. That was when the room changed. Mark's phone vibrated against the table. He glanced and frowned. A second later, Elaine's phone did the same. Her smile faltered just slightly. "What is that?" she asked. Mark checked his screen again. His shoulders stiffened. "It's probably nothing," he said, but his voice lacked certainty. The door opened quietly. Two men stepped inside, calm and unhurried. One introduced himself and mentioned compliance review. The words were measured, professional. He said there are procedures that need to be addressed. Certain accounts have been temporarily frozen pending verification. Elaine's hand shook as she reached for her phone. "This must be some kind of misunderstanding. We're very involved in the community." No one responded to that. Mark stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. "This is a private meeting. You can't just walk in here." The other man spoke evenly. "This will only take a moment." Mark turned toward me, his face flushed. "What did you do?" he demanded. I met his eyes for the first time since the meeting began. "Nothing," I said. I listened. The room felt smaller, heavier. The men explained timelines and next steps, using words like review and fiduciary obligation. Elaine sat rigid, her composure finally cracking. I gathered my bag and stood. Mark looked at me again, searching for the certainty he had lost. "This isn't over," he said. I paused at the door. It never was. Outside, the late afternoon light felt softer than it had in weeks. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel triumphant. I felt lighter. I had never raised my voice. I had never demanded anything. And yet, everything had changed.
Chapter 5. Justice did not heal me, but it set me free. The months that followed arrived without ceremony. No relief, no triumph, just time unfolding in careful increments, marked by envelopes in the mail, scheduled calls, and long stretches of waiting where nothing seemed to move at all. Justice did not announce itself. It accumulated quietly. The investigations stretched on longer than anyone expected. There were interviews that circled the same questions from different angles, requests for records that took weeks to produce, follow-up meetings that ended with more waiting than answers. Each step felt heavier,
not because of confrontation, but because of confirmation. The version of events I had been dismissed for questioning slowly became the version written down. The scope widened as the months passed. It was no longer focused only on Andrew. Attention turned to his wife Linda as well. The public image she had guarded so carefully began to fracture under routine scrutiny. Donations that did not align with timing, committees she influenced without holding formal roles, private conversations that shaped decisions while preserving plausible distance. It became clear that her role had never been passive. She managed perception while Andrew managed access. Together, they had maintained control by deciding who belonged and who did not. None of this came through confrontation. It came through documents, emails forwarded without realizing where they would land, meeting summaries that contradicted public statements, the kind of evidence that feels invisible until it is gathered in one place. The process was exhausting in ways I had not anticipated. There were days I questioned why I had continued at all. Healing does not pair well with prolonged vigilance. Every step forward seemed to demand another measure of patience, another piece of attention I was not sure I had left. The company responded with distance. Boards reorganized, committees were formed. Carefully worded statements were released, expressing concern without admitting responsibility. I watched from the outside, not because I was excluded, but because I no longer needed to be inside the room to understand how it worked. Some former employees reached out. A few apologized for assuming the worst. Others simply said that things made more sense now. There were also those who never contacted me at all. I accepted all of it. I had no desire to correct anyone or reclaim a narrative that no longer mattered. The house was sold near the end of the year, not as a victory, but as a closing of a chapter. I visited once before the final paperwork was signed. The rooms felt smaller than I remembered. I walked through them slowly, touching nothing. Grief had changed shape by then. It was no longer sharp. It was familiar, like a presence I knew how to carry. Margaret checked in often during that time. She reminded me to rest when I tried to push too far. She never spoke about vindication. She spoke about resolution, about the difference between being right and being free. I understood what she meant only after I stopped waiting for the outcome to feel satisfying. The legal consequences arrived in fragments. Certain accounts remained restricted, certain roles were relinquished quietly. Authority that once felt permanent became conditional. There was no public spectacle, no apology that felt complete. Accountability did not heal anything. It simply stopped what should not have continued. I learned that justice is not designed to restore what was taken. It is designed to prevent further harm. That distinction mattered more than I expected. There were consequences. Andrew lost the authority he assumed was untouchable. Linda lost the credibility she believed would always shield her. The structures they relied on shifted just enough to reveal how fragile they had always been beneath the surface. I did not feel satisfaction watching it happen. I felt distance, a sense that something heavy had moved out of my path. Time did the rest. I moved apartments. I unpacked boxes slowly, choosing what to keep and what to let go. I stopped checking my phone for updates that no longer required my attention. I slept through the night without waking to rehearse conversations that would never take place. One morning, I realized I had gone an entire day without thinking about the investigation at all. I made coffee, stood by the window, and noticed that the quiet no longer felt like something I needed to fill. I began making decisions again, small ones at first, what to decline without explanation, what to accept without guilt, where to place my energy. For the first time since my father died, the future felt like something I could approach rather than endure. People sometimes ask if it was worth it, the effort, the waiting, the uncertainty. I never answer directly. Worth is a calculation that assumes a measurable gain. What I gained was not restoration, it was agency. Justice did not repair what had been broken, it did not erase loss or return what had been taken, but it removed the weight of being erased while expected to stay silent. It allowed me to choose what came next without asking permission. That was enough. I still think about the day they decided I was expendable, about how close I came to believing it, about how easily silence is mistaken for weakness when people expect resistance to look loud. If you have ever been pushed aside at your weakest moment, told it was easier this way, I wonder what you would do. Would you rush to prove your worth, or would you wait and watch? Would you demand justice immediately, or would you have the patience to arrive on your own terms? And if this story mirrors something you've lived through, I would like to know how you chose to carry it forward.